When we talk about narcissism, we often think they're successful, right? But it feels very different when it's a narcissistic person who's unsuccessful. And it can feel very different to be in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic and who is unsuccessful, who goes from being successful to less successful to unsuccessful. In these cases, you can see a very unpleasant pattern unfold. But let's talk about some of the key differences in how this looks of a successful narcissistic person versus one who hasn't achieved that kind of ostensible success. Now, the easy one to describe is the successful narcissist. Some are, believe it or not, for all the entitlement and grandiosity. There are also some narcissistic people, in addition to having all those narcissistic traits, who actually are also quite disciplined and hardworking and determined and have really great creative ideas, and they're smart. When you take those qualities and you combine those with selfishness and entitlement and a bit slippery with ethics, and they're insecure, so their life is devoted to keeping their insecurity and shame demons at bay by succeeding, woohoo! This is a person who can be extraordinarily successful, like over the top. They can become innovators. They can also become scary bosses and scary politicians and scary entrepreneurs, but very, very successful. Successful on various metrics of power, of money, of influence. And as long as things are going well on these sort of external indicators of success, these narcissistic folks tend to be okay. Now, okay is a relative term here. The more successful the narcissistic becomes, the more fussy they get if even one small thing goes wrong. These are difficult bosses. They certainly can be difficult partners. But as long as the wave and the weather is going their way, they can also be quite generous, freewheeling, free spending. They may just be getting more and more successful, especially given how the world has become. But that's the paradox. The successful narcissistic person may never just rest on their laurels. They may even become a bit paranoid and suspicious, worrying about who is kind of coming up over their shoulder, feeling that they are more of a target the more successful they become. There's almost like a paranoia that, like I said, steps in. The hope would be that with all this success, with all this validation, with all this admiration, that the successful narcissist would then become nice and fun and easy to be with because they're winning. That they would then become a really nice partner or a nice parent or a great boss. No. All the traits, it's things like the entitlement. Their entitlement is just going to be there in all the ways. And as they get more successful, like I said, they feel almost more entitled to almost unrealistic standards of perfection. One thing out of place can set them off. It's as though their standards get impossibly difficult that they place on other people. While we would think the eternal validation that constantly comes at them would be enough to regulate their really, really sort of hair-trigger tempers and shame and vulnerability and insecurity, it's not. And it's almost as though the successful narcissistic person may just have more sweeping ways to shut down or even seek vengeance against anyone who gets in their way or disappoints them. The successful narcissistic person is a very emboldened narcissist. And while there may be some fun times on their good days if you're on their good side, it doesn't fix. And I know that there are people out there who hold out the hope, like maybe now that they own the business and they sold it for $1 gazillion trillion, and maybe one day when they finish school, and maybe one day when they make partner, and maybe one day when they get the promotion, and maybe one day they close the sale, get the award, get the bonus, things will get better. No. Maybe for a day, on the day they get the good news because they're happy. But the constancy of that sort of bubbling, smoldering insecurity, shame, and vulnerability is always there. And there is an insecurity that this can all go away. And oddly, the suspiciousness also climbs to a higher level, making the narcissistic person who's successful potentially even more combative. There can certainly be a bit of a success honeymoon. They may be in a better mood for a minute, after the promotion or the bonus. But like all honeymoons, it's going to come to an end. And then things may feel as difficult or even more difficult with the new unrealistic standards that the narcissistic person holds. And on top of it, now they're being emboldened by everyone because they're successful. So let's tip this over to the unsuccessful narcissist, because this is definitely worse. It is also not at all uncommon. Because entitlement, which is a universal characteristic of narcissism, doesn't mean matter if the person is successful or not. It can often lead a lot of narcissistic people to believe that things should be easy for them, or that they deserve success, or other people don't deserve success. It's not unusual for some narcissistic people to not have hustle. They just sort of expect stuff to fall into their laps. Narcissistic people also burn bridges. They get into fights with colleagues and bosses. They leave jobs in a huff, feeling that they weren't respected or given the treatment that they deserve. They get fired. And that certainly doesn't help success or earning potential. It can be difficult for a narcissistic person to sometimes even complete higher education. That aggrieved, resentful, sullen approach doesn't work well at school. They may drop out of college. They might drop out of graduate school. They might drop out of a technical training program. They often believe that they know more than the people there. They know more than the teachers. They're smarter than the people who run the program. They're smarter than their fellow students. They shouldn't have to pay for this. And with that chip on their shoulder, will either fail out or they'll drop out. Vulnerable narcissistic people may repeatedly keep trying business venture after business venture, maybe even getting people to invest. But their approach may be too grandiose. They may invest in the wrong things, build the business too fast, pay themselves too much, expect it to be easier, not be willing to have the humility to get proper advisement, and may not be willing to do the back-breaking work of keeping the business going. They'll compare themselves to other people where they said, oh, it seemed like it was so much easier for them. And with all of this, it's very easy for a new business to fall apart. There can be a deep-seated sense of resentment in narcissistic people, a sense of grievance, of feeling that they're owed something. It's a mopey, sullen quality and a brooding anger at other people who may be more successful, believing that those other people who are more successful just got lucky and don't deserve it, and they certainly didn't earn it. Now, for some narcissistic people who haven't found sort of success, there is a lifelong sense that life didn't go the way they wanted or the way they deserved it to. I mean, most of us could look back at our lives and say, some of this didn't go the way I wanted. But the big difference being that they will blame the world for their life not going the way they wanted in perpetuity. The unsuccessful narcissistic person is a difficult person. And in a way, this feels less surprising than with the successful narcissistic person, where we think, well, the successful narcissistic person is getting all the validation and the praise and the resource and the money, so they should be doing fine. Well, with the unsuccessful narcissist, in many ways, it just makes more sense that someone who is inherently grandiose and needs validation and is definitely not getting it, in fact, may even be thwarted in getting it, that they would be very unhappy and that they would subsequently take that out on other people. It isn't right, but it makes sense. We understand how this all works. However, this can often mean that people in relationships with narcissistic people who sort of never launched, who just keep trying and not succeeding, who don't seem to be able to hold on to jobs for a long time, whose lives didn't come together the way they wanted, will have empathy and sympathy for the narcissistic person, will feel bad for them. They'll try to fix it, to try to cheer them up, but nothing works. And the relationship can feel more and more like you are carrying a very wet and kind of stinky blanket around all the time. It may also mean that the other person in this narcissistic relationship is literally almost having to do double the work to earn money because the not consistently working narcissistic person isn't to take care of the household because the narcissistic person is simply not contributing because they're too busy brooding and sulking about how they aren't getting what they believe that they deserve. So it can be exhausting, backbreaking work for the other person in this kind of a relationship. Now, the presentation of vulnerable narcissism is often what we see in this kind of not successful narcissist model. In vulnerable narcissism, we'll often see a little less sort of the less social skill, less of the charm and charisma that allows a person can work a room and even advance in a job when they aren't that good at it. Charm and charisma can really get you a long way. In fact, that sort of oppositional, belligerent, grumpy, angry, all of those aspects of vulnerable narcissism mean that there are actually some people with that kind of personality style who are actually quite intelligent or skilled or smart, but they simply not only don't have the people skills, they keep burning bridges with leadership, with colleagues, with their own employees. So it's not like they don't have the smarts, they just can't be with other people. And vulnerable narcissism is also characterized by a sense that the world owes them something. And in line with that, we may not see a person, like I said, who's willing to do that hustle and work hard and get the second job and the third job, instead believing that things should just be easier for them. And again, the sense that they're owed something. And they will put a lot of time into complaining about how their life is unfair rather than summoning up the agency and doing something about it. In the most severe cases, a person with vulnerable narcissistic patterns may become verbally or even physically aggressive towards people because they are so disappointed and bereft about how their lives worked out. And they may just keep almost like gunning, looking for a fight and taking it out on other people. It's just like kind of poking other people. This can escalate to a place where it honestly gets almost risky for other people because the unsuccessful narcissistic person in some cases can be something of a powder keg. Relationships like this with somebody who's in this kind of a situation, these relationships are a misery. You don't even get the fun kicks that the grandiose, more successful narcissistic person may sometimes bring. In these relationships, it's a lot of complaining, and before long, the people who are closest to the narcissistic person are often blamed for the lack of success by the narcissistic person. Maybe if you were a better wife, I would be more successful at my job. If you kids would just shut up, I could just get more work done around here. Maybe if I had better people around me working with me, we would have actually gotten this project done. There is no research that exists that supports the idea that narcissistic people are more intelligent or less intelligent than people without this personality style. Narcissistic people are much better at talking about themselves as though they're smarter, but there's no evidence supporting that they actually are. There's also no evidence supporting that narcissistic people are more or less hardworking. Narcissism and antagonism dictate the expectations and responses a person with these kind of personality styles has about the circumstances of their life and how they respond to stressors. The universal characteristics of low empathy, the grandiosity, the egocentric, pathological selfishness, the status seeking, the vindictiveness, the excessive need for validation and admiration, and the willingness to lie, betray, manipulate, subjugate, dominate, and shift blame to get ahead or to stay ahead or to shirk taking responsibility. That can go either way. Whether or not a person has success or not, that characterizes all narcissism. Ultimately, success or no success, by this I mean more material success, these relationships are difficult and rarely successful. So to all of you out there who might be in a relationship with a narcissistic person who is successful and think, well, I thought once they got everything they wanted, they would calm down. Wrong. And we could already guess that those of you who are in relationships with narcissistic people where their lives or professional lives at least didn't take off the way they wanted. It takes a difficult situation and makes it all but impossible. Thanks again.